So our event tonight, obviously anniversaries often lead us to look backwards, whether that's a wedding anniversary or some other sort of anniversary. As you probably know, it's the 250th anniversary of America's founding. So that brings up the question, such as what was the nature of the founding? What were we intended to be as a nation? Or more specifically tonight, was America founded as a Christian nation? I think that issue is more relevant than ever given the deep disagreements today about America's identity and purpose. Actually, this is not a new question to raise. Back in a previous life, I was a history professor myself, and one of the first texts that I used as a professor was written in 1983. John will recognize this, I'm sure. The Search for Christian America by Mark Knoll, Nathan Hatch, and George Marsden. So this question has been around for quite a while and has been answered in a variety of ways. I can think of no one better qualified to speak to this conversation than John Fea. He was both a Christian committed to being faithful in seeking truth, but also a professional, a scholar who has spent decades immersed in American history. John is the Distinguished Professor of American History at Messiah University. He is the author and editor of 6 books, including Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? He did not bring books along with him, as authors usually do, but we have a copy downstairs in our library. It's in its 3rd edition, I believe?
Coming out in the third
edition.
This year.
Excellent.
Out. Yeah.
Okay, 3rd edition is coming out this year. It was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. He's also the author of Why Study History, reflecting on the importance of the past, and has authored numerous articles in Christianity Today, The Atlantic, USA Today, and many other publications. So the format will be one we often use here at the center. John will speak first, and then I will have some initial questions. I'm the director here, so I get to ask the first questions. And then we'll open it up to audience Q&A as well. And we will end about 7:15. You may also be aware that there's a basketball game going on tonight, so you won't miss too much of the basketball game if you want to watch Michigan, Nebraska when we're done here. Finally, one other connection that I have with John. We were both Bible college students back in the 80s, playing basketball, and in one trip, I was at Moody Bible Institute, and we took a trip out east, I think it was over spring break, and we played this team called Philadelphia College of the Bible that had this 6'8" center that no one on our team could guard. Well, that was John Fea. You'll see when he stands, he looks like a former basketball player. I think I remember us winning that game. I think John might remember that.
Sure. I have a different memory, yeah.
Okay. But we're really excited to have John with us tonight.
Have gone, if certain decisions were made at particular moments in the past, put things into context, right? So that's the kind of methodology that I come from as I think about this question, was America founded as a Christian nation? Now, of course, as Rick mentioned, this is an incredibly polarizing issue right now. In fact, I would argue that the study of the past, or the invocation of history in some ways, is at the heart of the kind of American culture war, right? If you can get the founding fathers, right, on your side, right, you can win a political argument. You can win an argument in the present if you can just prove that American identity, played out in a certain way. You see this all the time. It is not, by the way, locked into any particular political bent. People on the right do this, people on the left do this. To me, it's ahistorical thinking, right? To sort of go in, and this leads to another C that I would reject as a historian, and that is the C of cherry picking, right? Where we look at the past, oftentimes we look at the past in a kind of, we look for a usable past, right? We want to go into the past, find something that's useful for us, right? Pull that out so we can use that little slice of the past to make some kind of political, cultural, social argument in the present. And as a historian, that's not how I think. I'm wanting to understand the past, in this case, the 18th century, Christianity and the American Revolution, in all its nuance, in all its complexity, right? What did the founders really believe about Christianity? So historians can never be objective. We're always going to bring our biases to bear when we look at the past. It's inevitable, right? But what if you made as much effort as possible to kind of bracket off 20th, 21st century political, cultural ideas and looked at the founding on its own terms? Rather than I think it's actually selfish, right, to look at the past just to pull out what you need. And it's a selfish act towards the people who actually lived there. I mean, as a Christian, I believe these people who lived in the past were also created in God's image, right? They can't defend themselves, right? We as historians go in the past, or politicians go into the past and say, I'm going to use you for this. And the people who are being used from the 18th century don't have a say in it, right? So what if we were to think about Christianity and the American founding without using it to cherry pick what we need to win this debate, to make an interesting talking head point on MSNBC or Fox News or, something like that? What might that story look like? So this is what I'm after, historical thinking. Our natural inclination, the Stanford education professor Sam Weinberg called it, our psychological condition at rest is to find something useful in the past. But historical thinking, Weinberg says, is an unnatural act. We're forced to listen to the voices of an 18th century world that's long gone by, and only then to understand that world, and only then, once we've understood it, to think about what it might mean for us today. So that's the kind of, again, methodological kind of introduction to my talk. What I want to do in the rest of the time here is I want to give you 5 essential themes on Christianity, religion, and the founding. And this is not going to be very deep, but I'm giving you these 5 themes that I want you to consider. Some of you, even if you just hear these 5 themes, it might give you a more nuanced position. But some of you may want to dig even deeper into these 5 themes. But these are the 5 kind of assertions or themes or claims that I want to make about Christianity and American life. So let's get started. Here we go. Number 1, my number 1 claim. Americans have always believed that they were living in a Christian nation. Now, some of you red flags are immediately going up, right? What I mean by this, I'm not suggesting that people are right or wrong. Are right or wrong to believe that they're living in a Christian nation. I'm just suggesting between roughly the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 and the present day, or at least probably check that, probably up until about the 1970s or 80s, if you did not believe you were living in a Christian nation, you were in a decided minority in the United States. Again, I'm not suggesting that if you believe that, you're reading the Constitution correctly. I'm not suggesting that if you believe that, you are understanding the Founding Fathers correctly. What I am suggesting is you probably still believe, whatever you think about those other things, you feel you're living in a Christian nation. I was about 10 years ago, I was speaking at Newport, Rhode Island, where they have a rich history of religious diversity there. And I was speaking at a Quaker meeting, and I was on a panel with a Quaker, a Jewish rabbi, and me, and I think there was one other, maybe a Catholic priest. And I made this claim. And I was a little nervous with the Jewish rabbi next to me. I'm claiming America has always understood themselves to be a Christian nation. And then afterwards, he says to me, 100% correct. If anyone knows that we're living in a Christian nation, it's a Jew. Right? He went on rattling off, about how he, Christmas break and all this kind of all these Christian things rooted in our culture. Now, what you do with that claim, I'm at the moment I'm not interested in, but we'll come back to it. So let me give you some examples of this. So we'll start with a really kind of dark one, right? Here is the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. Some of this, if you know the preamble to the United States Constitution, some of these words may sound familiar, right? We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a more permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish the Constitution, right? The Confederates wanted to make sure that they had a reference to God in there because they said that they were a much more Christian society than the North, the Union, because the Union Constitution does not mention God. We'll get to that in a second, right? There were some ministers, by the way, Northern ministers after the Civil War, who were so upset with the fact that the Confederates had God in their Constitution and they didn't, that they formed an organization called the NRA. Not that NRA. The National Reformed Association, specifically designed to put a Christian amendment tacked onto the Constitution so they weren't shown up by the South. So let's be fair here, right? This is Rufus Choate. Rufus Choate was a senator from Massachusetts. He wrote an entire pamphlet titled A United, Loving, and Christian America. And his argument was that the Union, the United States, was a sacred union. It was created by God, right? That God somehow, in the Declaration of Independence, granted individual rights and so on. And this is a Christian country, he argued. And thus, we need to preserve that. And by trying to challenge that idea of the United States as a Christian country, the Confederates, or breaking up the Union, I should say, in the Civil War, the Confederates were committing sin because they were violating the sacred union, right? You may think that the North was Christian because they were against slavery, right? And that was part of the story, but the more dominant kind of defense of a Christian nation by the North during the Civil War was this breaking up of the Union over these kinds of things. And later the war became a war about slavery, and that was added into the mix. Now, what I'm trying to do here is to show you that this theme of America as a Christian nation has been prevalent in all kinds of ways in the 19th and 20th century. Now, people invoke Christian America or America as a Christian nation, but may not necessarily think about a Christian nation in the same way. So I was giving this talk at the University of Wisconsin last year, and a professor, history professor in the audience was very upset that I was referring to people as advocates of a Christian nation. They would never think of themselves as advocates of a Christian nation. And then I would try to pull up these quotes, right? So this is Washington Gladden. Anyone ever hear of him? He was a social gospeler, right? He believed that the gospel required not only one being saved and going to heaven, but the true gospel also required social action to solve the ills and the social problems, poverty, homelessness, and so forth, right? You can't be a true Christian if you're doing that. So he would be considered a progressive or a liberal Protestant in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is a quote from him. Every department of human life, the families, the schools, amusements, arts, business, politics, industry, national politics, international relations, will be governed by the Christian law and controlled by Christian influences. If you were to pull that quote out of context, and I didn't tell you who it was, it would sound like one of these Christian nationalists today, right? It would sound like one of these, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, Seven Mountain Dominionists. We want to control every aspect of American life. When we are bidden to seek first the kingdom of God, we are bidden to set our hearts on this great commission, to keep this always before us as the object of our endeavors, to be satisfied with nothing less than this. The complete Christianization of all life is what we pray and work for. Now, for Gladden, he wanted America to be Christian. What he meant by it was not like, we want to be pro-life or something like that. He meant a Christian nation is not going to let the poor suffer. A Christian nation is not going to let homelessness be a problem, racial injustice be a problem, right? If we really want a Christian nation and advance God's kingdom in the world, we will do these things. Very progressive, liberal Protestantism, but nevertheless, you pull this thing out of context without the historical context, it sounds like, someone on Fox News spewing MAGA Trump kind of stuff, right? I mean, so it's really interesting. Although, of course, Gladden would have a lot of disagreements with the, say, Christian right view of history today. But nevertheless, it's fascinating, the language. Billy Graham, someone probably most of you know. Billy Graham is preaching in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, in the middle of the Cold War. It's absolutely essential that for him, primarily, that people are saved, that they accept the gospel, that they come forward at the Billy Graham crusade. But let's not ignore the fact that he is also trying to get people saved so that the country will be more Christian, so that it will not be like those godless atheists or those godless communists over there in the Soviet Union. So there is this Christian nation dimension to what Graham, he talks about it all the time. We need people saved to show that America is a Christian nation, unlike our rivals in the Cold War, right? Here's Martin Luther King Jr. Now, again, this is a very similar point I'm going to make with this quote to the point I made about Washington Gladden, right? One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be, this is from the letter from a Birmingham jail, by the way. I didn't put my citation there. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the young high school and college students, the young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. Today, this phrase Judeo-Christian heritage has actually been hijacked in many ways by the Christian right, to talk about our Judeo-Christian values and, all these things that we were founded upon. But King used this language all the time, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So King is making a connection here between the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and Judeo-Christian values, right? In a way that would be very different, say, than Billy Graham or, some other, right? Again, he wants to end racial segregation, to end Jim Crow, to bring about racial reconciliation, racial justice in the world. And if we're a Christian nation, we need to be doing that. But again, my point here is not to argue, that these men, they're all men for the most part, are referencing the founding correctly or, whether they understand really what the founders believe. My point here is that there are a lot of examples out there of people from all political stripes and all Christian angles who are invoking the language that we are living in a Christian nation. We may not be living up to it, as King or Washington Gladden would suggest, but we're clearly living in a Christian. And that makes, I think, the world of say, 1980s America a little bit different than our own. Now, what changed? Real quick here, I just want to kind of walk you through some history. When did the idea that we were a Christian nation for the first time become a contested one? At what point did we start arguing about this? Right? If for much of American history it was a given, when did this become a debate? And there are several key dates here. We could come up with a bunch of other dates too, but these are the big ones that I've picked. In 1947, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Everson versus Board of Education of New Jersey, Hugo Black, Supreme Court Justice who wrote the deciding opinion, the opinion that was the one that was accepted by the rest of the court, the winning opinion, what's the word I'm looking for? The majority opinion, thank you. Basically argued that there was a wall of separation of church and state in the United States. And that wall, he said, was, anyone know? High and impregnable. Right? Clear-cut separation of church and state. I don't know, he draws from a letter that goes back to Thomas Jefferson, who talked about a wall of separation between church and state. That would be getting too deep into the weeds for this lecture. But the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot have, these things need to be separate. Now, why that's important for our story is In 1963, in the Engel v. Vital case, the Supreme Court, actually Hugo Black was still on the court, the Supreme Court applied Everson v. Board to prayer in public schools and said if there's a high wall that's impregnable, then we need to keep prayer out of public schools. And thus, that's where mandatory prayer was then removed from public schools. Very similar story a year later in Abington v. Shemp, in which mandatory devotional Bible reading was removed from public schools. If there's a wall, we can't be devotionally reading the Bible. There's nothing in there that says you can't read the Bible in schools that's like a textbook or to understand the Christian religion in an academic sense, but no more, let's read a passage and now go do likewise, right? Kind of stuff. 1965, you see this is all the 60s, by the way, right? The 60s are changing everything. The Hart-Celler Immigration Act, or the Immigration Act of 1965, basically opens the doors of America for the first time since the 1920s to immigrants who are non-Western, really for the first time in American history, to immigrants who are from non-Western backgrounds. Asians, Latin, South Americans, we can argue whether they're Western or not. Middle Eastern people, right? Massive flood of immigration. The greatest immigration flow in American history happens between 1965 and like 2015 in that area, right? Now, of course, these non-Western, people from non-Western places are bringing their religions with them as they come into the United States, thus creating a much more diverse, pluralistic religious landscape in the country. And this then becomes, a threat for many Christians to the Christian nation that we're trying to create, right? How can we call ourselves a Christian nation when we're becoming increasingly more diverse every single day? 1971, Green versus Connolly, another Supreme Court decision. In this decision, this is the famous Bob Jones decision. Some of you might have heard of this. The federal government, to be quick here, basically says, the United States government, the federal courts say that a college or a Christian academy, right, a university, college, or Christian academy, it really applied to Christian academies, but Bob Jones University was the kind of one that got all the attention. If they segregate based on race, then they will no longer be eligible for tax-exempt status or federal funding. Now, the born-again Christian who would soon come into office, Jimmy Carter, was a strong proponent of the decision of Green v. Connolly. But the conservatives in the South, especially, places like Lynchburg Baptist Academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, which was Jerry Falwell's school, and others, they are saying essentially, we don't want big government. This is where the critique of big government came in from Christian evangelicals, from evangelical Christians, right? We don't want big government coming down here. It's, by the way, the same argument that the Confederacy made during the Civil War, right? We don't want big government coming down here and telling us how to run our schools. We need to, if we want to segregate based on our biblical understanding of the Bible, that's a violation of our First Amendment rights. Freedom of religion. We could create our school any way we want. And of course, these schools had a long history of Jim Crow racial segregation based upon their reading of the Bible. So they made a religious argument, a First Amendment argument, right? But nevertheless, this then created tension, right? The government is coming in and they're trying to take away our Christian culture, which is, of course, deeply embedded, at least in parts of the South, with racial segregation. Roe v. Wade goes without mentioning, I'm guessing, in this crowd, but the legalization of abortion. Think about Roe v. Wade not only in terms of the legalization of abortion, but also in terms of a victory for the feminist movement, right? Women's rights. This threatens a certain kind of patriarchal Christianity that exists on the right, especially. And then finally, the bicentennial, right? This is 50 years ago now, right? We're celebrating the semi-sesquicentennial. I have a hard time with that one. But in 1976, people are thinking. They're thinking deeply about the founding. They're thinking about the past. Who are we as a nation? Much like we're doing this year, hopefully, right? Who are we? What did the founders really believe? And amidst all of these other culture war issues that have emerged in the 1960s and early 1970s, suddenly now people putting their focus on the founders, right? Well, maybe the founders were actually on our side, and maybe they would have been very upset with all of these things that have developed over the 1960s. Maybe we need to do something about this. Maybe we need to proactively get off off our couches and out of our churches and engage the world politically to defend these Christian nation, Christian America values. And thus in the late 1970s into the 1980s and on through today. I mean, you could draw a line of continuity between Jerry Falwell and the moral majority and the Christian right today. So this is the longest point, by the way, point one. But I just want to point. I got my eye on the clock. I just want to point out, this idea that, often we think about, well, we're in this culture war, right? But when did this whole question of Christian America become a contested one? When did we start fighting about this, and why, right? And so I think that's what I was trying to accomplish in the first slide. Now we'll get back. Let's dive into the founding now for the next 4 points. All right, number 2, the Bible was important to the founding generation. This is a picture of the Aitken Bible, which was a Bible. There's a false idea out there. It's not true that the Continental Congress published this Bible. That's not true. The Continental Congress, though, did endorse this Bible. Right? You're all familiar with the Continental Congress, right? The group that wrote the Declaration of Independence. So what do I mean when I say the Bible was important to the founding generation? There was a political scientist named Donald Lutz in the 1980s who took his team of, I think it was at the University of Houston, he took his team of political science graduate students and tried to decipher the quotes, which sources the founding fathers quoted in their work. And what he did in 1770s, 1780s, there's actually one from 1760s too, which is interesting for the lead up, to the revolution. I just put these two up there. And what he concluded was, of 544 citations made from Scripture, I think he defined the founding fathers as anyone who signed either the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the Articles of Confederation, which was this in-between government that we had for a while. You see the statistics there, right? 44% of the 544 citations of outside sources was the Bible. And then, political sources from contemporary political writings, the Enlightenment, the 18th century kind of intellectual thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, these kinds of people. Classical people, like the ancients, the Greeks, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, right? Those kind of people. And then legal is just contemporary kind of law books, right? And then other. And then it's, in the 1780s, I don't want to make too much of the fact that the Bible kind of dipped a little bit in the 1780s, but you see my point is not to compare the two. It's to suggest that the Bible was the most cited book by the founding fathers. Now, we could debate why they cited the Bible, right? If you read Tom Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Paine, who wrote this pamphlet, January of 1776, we got a couple more days to celebrate the 250th of Tom Paine. I've been meaning to write something about it, but I just haven't had the time. Paine quotes the Bible all the time. Now, from what we know, he didn't believe a word of it, at least in terms of it was inspired by God, right? So, and Paine's probably not included on this list because he didn't sign any of those documents. But the point is the Bible, number one. Now, like any kind of set of, any data, you interpret them in a however you want to interpret it. So you could say, yeah, the Bible is 44%, but it's below 50%. And if you add up all the other sources, right? It was mostly the majority was non-biblical literature that was being cited, especially in the 1780s, right, if you add that all. So, you can play fast and loose with this information. However, whatever your sort of political agenda is, I'm going to keep it nuanced, right, and complex, and suggest, the Bible's cited as number one, but overwhelmingly they also appeal to other sources when you add all these other ones up. So my larger point is the Bible is important. They're citing it, right? Now, I'm interested in actually, back to the pain illustration, how they're citing it, how they're using it, how they're interpreting the Bible during this period. So here's a perfect example. I don't have time to go into all the details of this, but you can find this document online, Sam Adams' speech before the Continental Congress. And there's a great historian, actually he's a political scientist named Daniel Dreisbach, who has a really interesting book about all of the references to the Bible that the Founding Fathers used. Published with Oxford University Press. It's a scholarly kind of treatment of this. But you'll notice, so let us awaken then and evince a different spirit, a spirit that shall inspire the people to preserve in this glorious struggle until their rights and liberties shall be established on a rock. And then I highlight the biblical, right? Matthew 7:25, right? The rains descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon, right? Beat the house. Or down next, in the gloomy period of adversity, Ecclesiastes 7:14. We have had our cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, right? I mean, that's clearly a reference to, so it's to Exodus. It tells us that many of these founders understood the Bible. They were biblically literate people and often used these phrases to put into their political speeches. Sam Adams is just one small example. I had a debate at a Christian college in Ohio, Malone College, with a political scientist named, I don't know if it's Mark David Hall or David Mark Hall, his name was. And he was making the point using things like this. He was saying, well, look at this. The Bible was everywhere. It's a biblical nation. The founders were trying to create a biblical nation. They used the Bible all the time, blah, 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 blah. And I was kind of pushing back and saying, just because they're quoting the Bible, that's like the vernacular of the day, right? It would be like us quoting, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen or something. That was the culture of the era. So the funny part about this was, I was suggesting if you look at the documents they produced, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, there are no references in those documents to Christianity. So I'm a historian, right? I want to see more of a smoking gun in the documents that were designed to create the United States. Because I would argue Sam Adams was a devout Christian. It makes sense that he's doing this. So he was like, no, it's the culture that was Christian, and thus it was a cultural founding, Christian founding, and we need to be a Christian nation today, he was arguing, because of that. So this bothered me, and I went home, I went back to the hotel, and I turned on, it was like NCAA tournament basketball week. I turned on a game, and I'm watching the game, and the announcer, I think it was Ian Eagle, that may not mean anything to anybody here. he says, it was like a 16-1 game, the 16 seed versus the 1 seed, and he's like, this is an amazing David and Goliath battle that's going on here. And I was like, it's a Christian game. It's like, it must be a Christian, right? There's the reference, David and Goliath, So I'm just kidding, but we need to be careful as to how the Bible is being used and if it's being interpreted, how it's being interpreted. So here's a great example, Galatians 5:1. This is the second most quoted verse of the founding era by founders or ministers, or any published material, right? So I'm going to read this to you. Think about it in the context of the revolution. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. So I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm a historian, so I did what historians do. I went back into the history of the church and looked at the way historically, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Augustine, Aquinas, Origen, some of you may have ever heard of him, 1st century, 2nd century, maybe 3rd century, right? How did these people interpret this verse? And almost universally, it was interpreted the way probably if you are a Christian, you've heard it interpreted by your member of your clergy, right? It is for freedom that Christ set us free. We're bound by a yoke of slavery. Some would say that it's sin, it's the sin nature. It's Satan, who's bounding us, right, as Christians and forcing us we're tied to slavery. And of course, Christ, by dying on the cross for our sins, lifted that yoke, that burden away from us and made us spiritually free, right? Have you ever heard this interpretation of it? Yeah, that's how everyone interpreted it, right? So I'm reading, then fast forward, I'm in the archives at Rutgers University, reading a notebook from a 18th century minister named Enoch Green from New Jersey. And I find this sermon in his notebook, sermon notes, and he's preaching on Galatians 5:1. This is in 1759, okay? Nothing surprising, exact same interpretation as I just gave, that all these historic, right? So I'm paging through, I'm a historian diligently working in the archive, right? In 1775, right after Lexington and Concord, all this, the revolution's the war's about to break out, he preaches from this passage again. Now I'm thinking, I'll just kind of skim over this because, if he's any pastors here, don't raise your hand. It's like you pull out the file, right? Oh, here's the Galatians 5 sermon from 17 years ago. Maybe no one will notice. It's a different congregation. They forgot about it. I'll just preach the same sermon, right? No. This time, it was all a metaphorical interpretation of the verse. Freedom, he described as freedom from the tyrannical acts, Stamp Act, Townsend duties, Boston Tea Act of the British Parliament and the King. The yoke of slavery. Slavery was a political term for many of the founding fathers. It meant anyone who took away our rights, our liberties, were enslaving us, right? So it's the slavery of Parliament has put a yoke on us as colonies, taking away our freedoms. And then this was the the major find. When you find this in the archives for historians, you just go, wow. He had the word then Christ with an equal sign, and on the other side of the equal sign it said Continental Army. So who's going to free us from this yoke of slavery? Who's going to free us from these taxes? George Washington and the Continental Army, that's who. And this is, I'm assuming he preached the sermon that way. It was in the notes, right, that he gave. So again, the question comes up. Yeah, everyone was quoting the Bible. They were preaching sermons. They were talking about, how are they using it, right? How are they, and again, I'm not a biblical scholar. I can't tell you if Enoch Green gave a accurate interpretation of Galatians 5. As a historian, I can tell you that it was a very innovative one, right? That probably hadn't been seen before. The second most quoted verse, number one most quoted verse during the Revolutionary era was Romans 13. Again, I'll read this and think about it in terms of the revolutionary context. Right? Anyone seen or listened to the soundtrack Hamilton, the musical? So think about Samuel Seabury, right? When I'm reading this. If you don't know what that means, I'll explain it later, or I'll. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Which side, the patriots or the Tories, the loyalists, who do you think like this verse the most? The loyalists, right? Because it essentially is saying, you rebels, you colonial rebels, you are not submitting to the authority of government, right? And yeah, are there reasons to, even if you believe there are reasons to overthrow government, is high taxes enough to stage an entire revolution? In fact, if you kept reading in Romans 13, there's a passage there, pay your tithes, right? Pay your taxes. So the Anglican clergy, the loyalists, the people who are on the side of Britain, they quoted this verse endlessly. Samuel Seabury, who is an Anglican clergy who appears in the Hamilton play, he doesn't necessarily quote this exactly, but this is the spirit of his resistance to Alexander Hamilton and the Second Continental Congress, if you know that play. I think it was Charles Inglis, who was a New York Anglican loyalist minister, who really put it well, to illustrate my point at least well, when he noted in a pamphlet that when Paul wrote these words in Romans, the church was going through the worst possible persecution it could under the authority of, I think it was Nero, who was the emperor, who was burning Christians in the Colosseum and so forth. And Inglis makes the argument in 1776 in his pamphlet and says, even then, Paul told people to submit to authority. Now that kind of, as Americans, that kind of shakes us to the core, that whole idea, right? But this led to, some of the Anglican clergy to say that the entire revolution, as one would then put it, was, quote unquote, conceived in sin, right? A violation of Romans 13. By the way, I don't know how well you know this, but he recently died. I think last year he died. John MacArthur. Does that name ring a bell to people? For his entire career, if you read his commentary on Romans, he makes the same argument as the Anglicans did. He actually says at one point that the revolution was a sinful event because it violated Romans 13. Now, of course, that didn't, never mind. I was going to say that didn't stop him from saying that they shouldn't listen to the government when they told him to open his church or close his church during COVID, but that's a whole, let's not get into that. So my point here on point 2 is the Bible is certainly important. It's also used in very creative ways. And I'll be quick on these last 3 points because maybe we can tease some things out during the discussion. This gets people mad, certain kinds of Christians mad when they see this title, but it's true. There's no reference to God, to Jesus Christ, to Christianity in the United States Constitution. It's just, there's nothing there. The closest you get to religion are in 2 places. One in Article 6, which says there will be no test oath for holding federal office. In other words, you don't have to believe something religiously to hold federal office. And then in the First Amendment, which technically is not even part of the original Constitution, it came a couple of years later, this is the disestablishment or the establishment clause, right? There will be no official state church, like England had the Anglican Church, right? There'll be no official state church in the United States. And of course, the free exercise of religion is mentioned, right? But other than that, nothing. There's always someone in the audience, hopefully not here, who will raise their hand and say, but the Constitution ends with the phrase, the year of our Lord, signed the year of our Lord, 1789. And you got me, right? The Lord is mentioned. And then usually they don't like to hear that I'm almost 100% sure, I can't be entirely sure, but if you read the minutes, they never debated that. That was the common way of saying the date. And it was probably just tacked on after everybody left anyway by the scribe who wrote the document. So nothing in the Constitution about God. However, there are most of the states, the only exception really being Virginia, but most of the states did have test oaths for office or religious establishments. Because the 10th Amendment says anything that's not covered in the Constitution, you can do it yourself. You can make up your own rules about church and state. So I used to live in Pennsylvania. Here is a quote from the Pennsylvania State Constitution of 1776. In order to vote or hold office, you must swear to this in Pennsylvania in 1776. I do believe in one God, so you can't be a polytheist, right, or an atheist, right, to vote. The creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be given by divine inspiration. So that kind of rules out Jews as well, right? So if you want to hold office in Pennsylvania, you have to conform to this. Now, later on, when the Constitution comes, you have states that have things like this, but yet the Constitution says you can't have a test oath or an established church. So you see, this is called federalism, right? You know, the states can do what they want on this issue. And so Massachusetts, for example, has a state church until 1833. If you're a Baptist in Massachusetts and you are living in a state where the state church is Congregationalist, you have to pay tax money to support the Congregational church, even though you don't go to that church. That's what I mean by a state church, right? So they all exist up until 1833. So that complicates things a little bit. What is the nation, right? Is it a loosely collected group of states, like under the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s? Is it a unified, how do we judge, right? Because clearly Pennsylvania wants Christians to be running their government. And I could give you similar examples from 11 other of the colonies. We could also have a discussion about why Virginia is different. And I would just list two names there, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were arguing for more of a complete separation of church and state. 4, the founders were champions of religious freedom. To a man, every founding father defended the right of all people to worship God freely in their churches without government interference, or to not worship God at all. Right? They're all very clear about this. George Washington writes this famous letter. He actually wrote a letter to multiple churches, multiple denominations, including even this little kind of weird sect called the Swedenborgians, that was believed in multiple heavens and, kind of weird things like that, at least weird for the time. Says you have the right to worship the way you want, right? Here's the Torah synagogue. I was talking about this synagogue before when I was in Newport, Rhode Island. Longest operating synagogue in the United States. He wrote a letter to this synagogue as well, saying you have complete religious freedom under my presidency. Jefferson, Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, probably the most famous document of religious liberty ever written, defending the idea that everybody has right to worship God freely without government interference. Now here's the complexity. Remember the C's of historical thinking, right? Here's the complexity, right? Based on the last slide, you're free to worship any way you want. But in a lot of states, you can't hold office or vote, right? Unless you uphold the New Testament, inspiration of the New Testament, and so on and so forth. Right? So this creates a really interesting dilemma as to what religious freedom and how the founders applied religious freedom. And then finally, the founders, to a man, even the religious skeptics like Franklin and Jefferson believed that religion was good for the republic. Think about Thomas Jefferson's farewell address where he says religion and morality is an essential pillar to the creation of the republic. John Adams said that the United States Constitution was built for a moral and religious people, right? Again, we can break down what they meant by that, but they all meant something slightly different by it. Some did not necessarily single out Christianity, but rather religion. But nevertheless, they believed that religious people made good Republican citizens. Now, I'm a couple minutes over here, but let me finish with this point. Remember, the founders were not theologians. They were not religious leaders. They were statesmen. They were trying to build a republic. And they knew that a republic required virtuous citizens. And what they meant by virtuous citizens were people who were at times willing to sacrifice their own interests, their own selfishness, for the greater good of the republic. And if religion helped people do that, right? Religious people know how to sacrifice their own self-interest if they practice it, right? Their own self-interest for something greater, God or, whatever, Jesus, or whatever the God happens to be. Those people would make good citizens because they knew how to give up their self for the larger community. And religion helped people do that. Now, I always say this. If there was some form of religion that rather than supported the republic or, strengthened the morals of the people. If there was some kind of religion that didn't do that, so I taught at a Brethren Anabaptist college for 23 years, right? Where we don't fly an American flag on campus because Messiah University believes that the kingdom of God is always higher than the nation, right? So no American flags, although technically we're compromisers because there's one in the gym because of NCAA regulations, but that's a whole, yeah. We can revisit that another time. But if there was a religion that was a prophetic religion, a religion that always critiqued the Republic and the founders and what they were trying to build, I'm convinced that the founding fathers would not have a whole lot of use for that kind of Christianity, right? So, again, a complex answer there to number 5, but the founders certainly believed that religion was good for the Republic. So where have we been? We've talked about the fact that America has always perceived itself, whether right or wrong, as a Christian nation. The Bible was important, although they often used it in creative ways. The Constitution does not mention God, but the states are loaded with test oaths and establishments. What was my 4th point? I'm blanking here. Religious freedom, right, for all people. And finally, religion was also important to sustaining the Republic. My hope is that as we approach the 250th anniversary, and again, I know I'm really hoping, it's a long shot, that Americans would think in a much more historical way, right, about the founding. And then when we go to build our political movements and public policy and so forth, and we draw on the founding, we do it in a way that honors what the 18th century founders would have thought about this rather than cherry picking what we need. Thank you. Move this to the side here. Where are we going here?
All right, thank you so much. You pull up that chair, I'll grab a chair. After that first point, I never thought you'd finish by 7, but I was impressed. That's great. No, thanks so much. That was fascinating. I'll have a couple questions to begin with, and then I'm sure there are plenty of questions out here as well.
This is the fun part for me.
Right.
I love
So this book has been out in various versions for quite a while. You've had you've talked about the subject a lot. I'm curious, in your experience, in how you try to nuance this question, do you receive more pushback from, say, secular progressives or from Christian conservatives?
Definitely Christian conservatives. Again, it depends on the audience. I've done it in all kinds of, secular environments, at universities that not at the Christian Study Center, right? At a university lecture or so forth. I do find that Christian conservatives are the ones. I can come into. I have multiple times where the lecture's been advertised exactly the way you've advertised it here, and someone will come up to me before the lecture and say, the clear answer is yes, and it doesn't matter what you say. That has happened to me multiple times, right? So usually people come up to me and say, they already have their mind made up, and they just want kind of cherry-picked ammo to use for their own agendas. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the founding fathers, were very diverse. I don't even like using the term founding fathers. I often tell my students, which founder, right? Or you hear on the news or on when these debate on TV, on cable news or whatever, the founding fathers would have done this. I'm like, okay, which one, right? Which one are you talking about, right? It's a much more. So I think definitely there are progressives who are deeply invested in it being a totally secular founding that are wrong, I think, historically. But they're not as loud and they don't get as angry with this lecture as someone who is deeply invested in the idea that we're a Christian nation and that nation needs to be restored, reclaimed, renewed, and build a politics around that kind of claim. Yeah.
So you've been dealing with the subject and history for a long time. Has your own view of the past ever change in response to any document you came across or a conversation with someone else, or has it been kind of static throughout?
I think it's been pretty. I think I've been pretty straightforward with the argument, but I've stressed different things at different times. So this has been a 15-year run with this book, right? So, I do think there was a time when I wanted, if I was, well, it's really audience, right? If there's been times where I've been with like secular audiences who want me to reinforce their position of a secular founding, and I've maybe stressed some of the Christian dimensions or religious dimensions a little more just to, be provocative and not kind of just give them what they want to hear. And then I think I've been told when I speak to Christians that they often feel that I'm, deliberately trying to be provocative to kind of go against the Christian right, whatever you want to call it, kind of view. But I've stayed pretty consistent, and I think the only inconsistency is how much I emphasize depending on the crowd, in that sense. So there's not much that's changed. This third edition is actually interesting. It's going to only be like a concise edition. It's only going to be 40,000 words, which will be a very thin book. The big book is I think 140,000 words. So it'll be condensed, but it's going to have 2 new chapters too. So I don't know how I pulled that off, right? To condense it to 40,000 words and still add 2 new chapters. But it's still pretty consistent with the book I published in 2011, yeah.
So if you have a question, please identify who you are first and then ask your question. Keep it brief, please, your question. And I will kind of re-summarize your question and do my best since we're recording this as well.
Absolutely.
The recording won't pick that up. So, yes, Steve.
I think she raised her hand.
Okay, sorry. I didn't see that hand first.
My name is Steve Gonzalez. You began the lecture with reference to the mid-20th century use of the Bible. And then you made reference to the late 18th century use of the Bible. But it felt like there was sort of this middle gap of the 19th century. And that was sort of the heyday for rationalism.
Yeah.
And the authority of the Bible being significantly questioned.
Yeah.
And particularly in light of Pennsylvania's requirement to sign a document that says divine inspiration. How did rationalism influence or impact the political landscape on using the Bible?
I mean, that's a great question. I can answer.
Real quickly. So how
it.
did rationalism and primarily 19th century impact the use or understanding of the Bible in America?
Yeah, I probably would push back a little bit on the sort of phrase 19th century. It's a long period of time. I think prior to the Civil War, I think you still have a very much a kind of evangelical, at least a Protestant nation, where the Bible can be used both to encourage believers, Christians, right, but also for political purposes. There's a lot of the kind of, if you go to places, you'll hear certain Christian nationalists, quote unquote historians, who will point out, like, look at this on the Washington Monument. I'm not going to remember the exact. There's this Bible verse or whatever. Well, I think they're the product of a very kind of a Christian nation that the children and the grandchildren, I mean that literally, are trying to create in the 19th century. After the Civil War, I think the Enlightenment, rationalism, higher criticism of the Bible, Darwinism, I think all of these things completely changed the landscape. So one could actually argue that the roots of the culture wars did not really start in the 1970s, but you can make a pretty compelling argument that the fundamentalist modernist controversy, right, that debate between the two sides, probably was a forerunner to some of these things. The way the historians tell the story is the Scopes trial is pivotal, because this is the Scopes monkey trial, evolution trial, because
1925.
It was 1925. Yeah, it was such a defeat. Actually, William Jennings Bryan and the creationists won the case, but the public response to kind of an embarrassing presentation about a very intellectually shallow defense of creationism by William Jennings Bryan kind of turned evangelicals inward. and they stopped wanting to engage the larger culture. And then they were kind of silent on political issues until using the Bible in the public square or whatever until the 70s. But it's huge. I mean, some of the roots of this come out of but the fundamentalists are also, they're the ones who are defending the inerrancy of the Bible, the inspiration of the Bible. They're also, have a, they want to create a Christian civilization, right? I mean, there's a famous book by Rick's dissertation mentor George Marsden on fundamentalism in American culture, where at least, I don't know if it's still on the cover, but there's this picture of this fundamentalist with the I think like a Greek columns, like almost like Samson, right, crashing upon him, and he's trying, and it says modernism, and he's the fundamentalist trying to hold up the structure, right, in that sense. Yeah.
You have a question?
Hi.
Yes.
So I want to put on our causation versus correlation hat for number 2.
Sure.
That the Bible was important to the founding generation. So at the time, right, the majority of the population were not well read because they weren't walking distance to a vast library where they could read collections from all around the world, right?
Yeah.
Very, very limited.
Well, yeah. I don't know how central that is to your coming to the argument you're about to make, but I'll leave it. Go ahead, keep going. Yeah.
So if I'm going to speak in the vernacular of my constituency,
Yeah.
what does most of my constituency have? So if I'm speaking in that vernacular, I'm maybe not going to be speaking in the words of somebody who has access to, 1,000-volume library.
Yes.
I'm speaking the vernacular of the book that they may have at home based off of where they were born.
This is Thomas Paine, I think, what he's doing in Common Sense. Yeah.
Right. So is it causation or is it correlation?
You're going to have to help me with that in terms of.
Was it important to them, or was it the vernacular of speaking to their constituency?
Well, I mean, the people who are writing, like, I don't know if you want to use Tom Paine as an example. I think he's trying to get, like I said, I think he's trying to use the Bible to win a political argument, get people to come along with overthrowing the crown in that sense. How people read it, how people read Paine might, that's hard to tell. We know it was the most read book in the 18th century. But certainly they would have, I don't know how they would have thought about those biblical verses. I'm sure it was very convincing to people, so they would have accepted the fact that, the Bible says kings are bad, right? Saul was the king, God gave the people Saul because they were complaining about a king, and that's what's happening right now with George III. So, I think there is a kind of common sense, if you want to call it, reading of the Bible that's going on in the 18th and 19th century by ordinary people. Right? That when they see a biblical verse quoted, they immediately take it, they don't think critically about the way the verse is being used. They don't put the verse into context about, what is Paine, why is Paine, these are what educated people do, right? They say, well, what is Paine really trying to do here, right? No one's asking that when they're reading Common Sense. So I think it's incredibly compelling among a biblically literate population. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but close, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a PhD student. I had a question related to when thinking about references to scripture. You talk in a good amount of detail about the allusions, like that you can trace to specific passages in the Bible. One thing I'm wondering about is ways in which the thought processes of founding fathers may have been influenced by the Bible, even if it wasn't necessarily in ways that they directly quoted.
Yeah. So I think there's a. I think
try
there's.
to summarize that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were going to summarize it.
Oh, well, you want me? Oh, okay, yeah. So I guess the question is, if I'm hearing it right, why did the founding fathers, were they kind of unconsciously maybe influenced by a culture of biblical literacy as opposed to deliberately taking the scriptures and saying we're going to apply this to the nation?
It need not be unconscious.
Yeah.
Like just as I might read, like as a part of my training in medical school, I have a certain background of reading certain
Yeah.
thought process, that influences how I approach things
Yeah.
in decision making.
Yeah.
So is something like that
Sure.
seen in the case of
Well, I think you could make an argument. I think it's a fair argument. People have made it. The historian Tom Holland, who has this big book about Christianity and Western culture, Nicholas Walterstorff, the Calvin University philosopher, has made this case. I think you could make an argument that the Christian tradition, or the Jewish and Christian tradition, deeply informs a lot of the founders' views about morality, right and wrong, and so forth. They were shaped by that in really, really profound ways. But I also think that the founding fathers, especially in the way they separated church and state, which was unheard of in the, I think the Netherlands maybe had something similar, but that was about it, right? The way they separated church and state, the way they kept scriptural references out of the documents, even the references to God in the Declaration of Independence, one could debate, are very vague and not Christian, right? In some ways, and this gets back to the question about the culture of the people, in some ways they were very countercultural. Right? They were embracing a way of thinking about religion and government that the world had never seen before, because Christianity was always, at the forefront of how to think about an ordered society. They were suggesting you could have an ordered society with or without Christianity. If Christianity helps, certainly we endorse it. We're not against Christianity. So I think there's both an inheritance of Christendom, if you want to call it that they would have inherited the Ten Commandments, these kinds of things. But at the same time, because of the influence of the Enlightenment, they tend to make very countercultural moves from what the people in the pews or in the the farmers or whatever are upholding. So again, I'm not sure that gets at the idea of your question, but they both are true, I think, at the same time.
Okay. Yes.
So you mentioned that all the most of the founding fathers, they weren't so much for like what we call Christian religion, but they were all for religious freedom.
Yeah.
They're what I would imagine, like in England, having a state church would have been uncomfortable. But why do you think they were so motivated by religious freedom?
Yeah, I think there's two reasons why. One is that there is a, especially Jefferson and Madison, who are the champions of religious freedom, right? There is this sense in the Virginia and the Chesapeake region, Maryland, Virginia, that there's this long history of religious persecution by the established Anglican Church. So when Jefferson brings in what I think is a totally Enlightenment view, John Locke and so forth, of religious freedom, right? The evangelicals on the ground, Methodists and Baptists especially, love it, even though it's based on secular ideas, because they've been persecuted by Anglicans, literally physically persecuted by Anglicans. So there's a groundswell for this in Virginia. And again, it depends where you are. In Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the so-called mid-Atlantic colonies, you have the influence of Quakerism. William Penn, who was, again, a persecuted minority in England, who tried to establish a society that would be based on freedom for all people, no matter what their religious beliefs. In New England, you don't have a long history of religious freedom, at least with the people who are in control, but you also have some prime examples, especially Roger Williams, this guy from Rhode Island, who was basically thrown out of Massachusetts because he wouldn't toe the line on baptism and a few other doctrines. And he wrote tracts on religious freedom. So you have people like John Locke, you have other Enlightenment thinkers advancing this idea of religious freedom, challenging state churches, right, and their power. And then you have a Christian, especially among Baptists, a Christian understanding of the separation of church and state. Roger Williams said there is a garden between church and state, right? I don't think Thomas Jefferson got it from Williams, which was 100 some odd years later, because we know every book in Jefferson's library, and there was no copy of Williams in there. That doesn't mean he didn't read it, but it just wasn't in his library. So it's a mix. It's a mix of all of these forces that are associated. Someone mentioned rationalism before, the Enlightenment. Where people are starting to rethink, the way government and religion should function, right? So it's this particular moment, right? We can't forget that the founding happens at this significant change where the Enlightenment is beginning to gain ground in the British-speaking world. And the founding fathers, as educated people, right, as people who do have the big libraries, are reading these people and actually applying it to their creation of a republic, without ignoring, I think, some of the Christian separation of church and state issue. I mean, separation of church and state it first appears in North America because of Baptists. Right? This is before the Enlightenment, right? Baptists didn't like being persecuted in Europe. So they said, keep the government out of our business, right? So, the roots of separation of church and state are in these, is directly related to Christianity. We don't want government interfering. Yeah.
I think, do you have one last question, sir, and then we'll have to finish.
Okay. Me?
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Don Q. Patterson.
Yeah.
I am a PhD student over at Liberty University.
Okay.
And I am a local head of school at Christian school. So I would say that our founding fathers, the documents that they built, they took from the virtuous and the morality of the Bible when they were building some of those principles, thus having religious freedoms. So would you say now, with the influence of secular systems and the acceptance of multiple religions in the society that we have today, do you see a space where the Constitution is impacted and will become a society more like the world and less religious freedom?
What will become a society? The nation or the church?
The nation.
Okay.
So speaking of the United States.
Yeah.
And this will impact the church possibly, depending on your take, and your view. But do you see us kind of making that turn from having less religious freedoms and more, I would say, more like the world, so to speak? And what I mean by the world, you look at some other countries and they adopt communism, or they adopt
like the Muslim world, where there's not a whole,
where they impose Sharia law and things like that. The more we get away from Christianity within the United States, if we gear back towards that way, depending on who's in office and what their particular goals are, do you see the United States becoming more like the world?
There's a lot in that question.
I'm not going to try to summarize that question. So
there's a lot in that question. And did everyone hear it okay? Yeah. One quick thing I'll say at the beginning is, I think the idea of the Bible informing the founders' idea of virtue is partly true, not entirely true. And what I mean by that is the 18th century idea of a virtuous citizenship, a virtuous republic, right? The idea of virtue is not the same way we think about virtue today, right? There's been the Victorian novel virtue, right? A woman being virtuous, chaste, whatever. That has been inappropriately, I think, at least superimposed on the founding fathers to say it means the Bible or morality or Christianity. Really, virtue is a pagan concept. And what I mean by pagan, I mean not Christian. It came from the Greeks and Romans who were trying to create republics. And a virtuous citizen, like I defined it, it was really a political term. It meant someone who was willing to sacrifice their interests for the greater good of, Zeus could have helped someone to do that, right? To sacrifice their interests for the greater good of the republic. It didn't have to be informed by Christianity, but it could be the Bible, right? So I'm not going to completely disagree with that statement. In terms of the idea of religious freedom, I mean, this is really loaded in some ways, for me at least, because yes, there are nations, whether it be the former Soviet Union or Sharia law, Muslim nations, and so forth, that do not afford the kind of religious freedom that we have, right? The question is, would more Christianity, right? Would a revival, right? Christian revival, as you hear others say, would that help the United States become less like these other countries and celebrate religious freedom more, right? I think is what you're kind of getting at here. Well, you'd have to look at the way, that's a theological question, but thinking about it in terms of just being an observer, there are forces that in this country, right, that want religious, that say they want religious freedom, but only for them. Right? They only want religious freedom for their position, so we'll keep out this group or that group or make sure they don't populate or something. If that's what more religious freedom means, then I don't think the founders would have embraced that. I think Jefferson and others were very clear about the fact that even though there were no Hindus, and it was always spelled Hindoos, right? There were no Hindus, Muslims, all these people in the country. They were many of them, not all of them, but many of them were clear that they were forward-looking people to say that if these people did exist in large numbers, they would be religiously free as well. So does one need to have Christianity to uphold a belief in religious freedom? That's a question that we can debate. I think the founding fathers would said you don't necessarily need, and I got to answer this historically, right? You don't necessarily need to have one particular faith being more prominent or robust than other particular faiths to observe religious freedom. I think sometimes you just need a government that wants to uphold the Constitution and the First Amendment, rather than catering to one group or something to that effect.
Well, we'll let that be the last word. Thanks, John,
Thanks.
for being here.
Yeah, good question. Yeah.